These are 15 films from 1989 that lost Hollywood well over $100 million. Batman and Indiana Jones dominated that summer, but these expensive productions crashed and burned in spectacular fashion. From forgotten final films of legendary directors to star vehicles that ended careers entirely, these are the movies Hollywood wishes you'd forget. A film so obscure that most people have never even heard of it marks the beginning of our countdown. Rooftops hit theaters in March of 1989, and what makes it genuinely heartbreaking is that it represents the quiet, sad conclusion to one of Hollywood's most celebrated careers. Robert Wise directed West Side Story and The Sound of Music, two of the most beloved musicals ever made. This was the same filmmaker who helmed The Day the Earth Stood Still, a man who collected multiple Academy Awards throughout his legendary run. At 75 years old, Wise decided to step behind the camera one final time for what would become his 42nd theatrical feature. And the result turned into a disaster nobody saw coming. The concept looked promising on paper, with Wise hoping to recapture some of that West Side Story energy through a story about young people living in squatter communities on Manhattan rooftops. Combat dance, which was essentially capoeira, would feature prominently, and the whole thing carried an anti-drug message meant to resonate with younger audiences. Jason Gedrick, Troy Beyer, and Tisha Campbell Martin filled out the cast. $7 to $8 million went into making this movie, and the box office brought back just $1.1 million. That's a loss somewhere between $6 and $7 million, which meant New Century Entertainment's joint venture with Cineplex Odeon kicked off with one of the year's biggest embarrassments. Critics showed no mercy. Time Out labeled the film painfully disappointing and pointed out that it simply never delivers the punch. Roger Ebert pinpointed exactly where everything went wrong when he observed that Rooftops comes alive during the passages of music and dance, but then tries to fit those flights of fantasy into a melodrama about drugs, concluding that it amounted to too tight a squeeze. An interesting historical footnote exists here that couldn't have been anticipated at the time. Pre-gentrification, Lower Manhattan provided the backdrop, and the World Trade Center towers appear visible in several shots, which means those images now serve as an inadvertent time capsule of a New York that no longer exists. Luis Guzman shows up early in the film, years before he became a recognizable character actor. MTV tried to drum up interest through a promotional special aimed at younger viewers, but none of it worked. Rooftops vanished from theaters within weeks, and Robert Wise never directed another feature film. One actor's dreams of movie stardom ended with this next disaster. Worth Winning arrived in theaters with the goal of making Mark Harmon a leading man, but instead it buried his film career in a single weekend. A proven path from television to movie stardom existed in the late 1980s, and the blueprint looked clear enough. Bruce Willis had already made the transition successfully, Tom Selleck appeared to be following the same trajectory, and Mark Harmon seemed positioned to join them after his television success. Worth Winning represented his breakthrough moment. Dan Lewandowski's novel provided the source material, casting Harmon as a Philadelphia weatherman who makes a bet that he can convince 3 different women to accept marriage proposals from him. Madeline Stowe and Leslie Ann Warren rounded out the supporting cast, and 20th Century Fox showed enough confidence in the project to schedule it for summer release in 1989. Harmon even hosted a promotional special leading up to the premiere, and that's when the studio lost faith entirely. Fox pulled the film from its summer slot and, according to reports, unceremoniously dumped it into October instead. The result proved catastrophic, with the film disappearing from theaters after just 2 weekends. Critics found the entire premise distasteful from the start. Rotten Tomatoes later captured the consensus perfectly. A distasteful comedy with a manipulative main character who's never as charming as the filmmakers intend. Aside from a strangely eclectic collection of supporting actors, Worth Winning offers nothing you'd want to spend 90 minutes with. The career damage to Harmon landed hard and stuck, combined with his previous disappointments in The Presidio and Stealing Home, which brought in only about $7.4 million between them. Worth Winning effectively closed the door on his leading man movie ambitions. Television called him back with reasonable doubts in 1991, and eventually he landed the role that truly defines his legacy today, Leroy Jethro Gibbs on NCIS. Comedian David Brenner made his motion picture debut in this film, which qualifies as a fun bit of trivia. Devin Rattray also appears here, years before audiences would recognize him as Buzz in Home Alone. Hollywood learned exactly the wrong lesson from a hit movie, and Winter People stands as proof of what happens when a studio copies surface elements while missing everything that made the original work. April 14th, 1989 brought this film to theaters, starring Kurt Russell and Kelly McGillis under Ted Kotcheff's direction. Columbia Pictures distributed it with a $10 million budget, and the box office returned just over $2 million, which meant a loss of approximately $8 million. TCM's analysis of what went wrong cuts deep. They observed that Hollywood then did what it does best: desperately try to replicate past success instead of moving in a new direction. The reasoning must have seemed obvious to the studio executives at the time. McGillis had been a hit in Witness, playing a single mother living in a rural community cut off from the outside world. So why not recreate that formula with Kurt Russell stepping into Harrison Ford's shoes? Roger Ebert provided the answer with a 1-star review, writing that Winter People has the same relationship to Witness that a negative number has to a positive number. The shape and form are the same, but there doesn't seem to be anything there. The specific problem he identified came down to one of the missing elements being any chemistry between McGillis and Russell. Trouble plagued the production from the start. Plumtree, North Carolina served as the filming location, where the crew used the actual town with minimal modifications and built only one significant addition: a wooden bridge. A flood washed that bridge away during filming, and then strong winds tore down parts of the remaining set. Thanksgiving 1988 represented the original release target, but delays pushed it to April 1989. TCM noted that the film received an almost non-existent marketing campaign and opened in just 298 theaters, coming in at 14th place. Jennifer Warnes recorded Jimmy Webb's song "Lightning in a Bottle" for the soundtrack, and reportedly Webb considers it his favorite recording of that particular composition. The out-of-print soundtrack album now commands over $100 on the used market. Few films better illustrate the nightmare of Hollywood development than this troubled time travel thriller that spent a decade bouncing between directors, studios, and rewrites before finally limping into theaters. Millennium opened on August 25, 1989, through 20th Century Fox and Gladden Entertainment, with Chris Christopherson and Cheryl Ladd filling the lead roles. Opening weekend brought in just $1.6 million, landing the film in 12th place. Writer John Varley described the ordeal in painful detail when he recalled, "We had the first meeting on Millennium in 1979. I ended up writing it 6 times. There were 4 different directors, and each time a new director came in, I went over the whole thing with him and rewrote it. Each new director had his own ideas, and sometimes you'd gain something from that, but each time something's always lost in the process, so that by the time it went in front of the cameras, a lot of the vision was lost." The original plan looked far more ambitious than what audiences eventually saw. Paul Newman and Jane Fonda represented the proposed leads, with Douglas Trumbull, the special effects wizard behind Silent Running, attached to direct for MGM. But here's the thing. When Trumbull publicly criticized MGM during a controversy following the passing of actress Natalie Wood, he became persona non grata across Hollywood. Directors cycled through the project after Trumbull's departure, with Richard Rush, Randall Kleiser, and Philip Borzos all taking their turn before Michael Anderson, who had directed Logan's Run, finally shepherded it to completion. By that point, the budget had been significantly lowered from whatever the original vision required. Release timing couldn't have landed worse. August 1989 meant going up against Batman, Parenthood, The Abyss, When Harry Met Sally, and Lethal Weapon 2. Critics found the leads lacking chemistry and reserved particular mockery for the robot character Sherman, which one reviewer claimed made C-3PO seem as witty as Oscar Wilde. One amusing production story survives from the shoot. The outdoor Boeing 747 crash set looked so convincing that pilots landing at Toronto Airport actually radioed in what they thought represented a real plane crash. Proportional terms tell the story of 1989's most spectacular failure. Slaves of New York lost 93% of its investment, making it one of the most efficient ways Hollywood found to burn money that year. March 18, 1989, marked the release through TriStar Pictures, with Merchant Ivory handling production on a $5 million budget. The box office returned just $463,972, which translated to a loss of over $4.5 million. What makes this failure so remarkable comes down to the pedigree behind it. Merchant Ivory Productions had just delivered successes like A Room with a View and Morris, representing the gold standard for prestigious literary adaptations. But with Slaves of New York, they attempted something radically different by adapting Tom Janowitz's best-selling short story collection about shallow artists in New York's downtown scene. Roger Ebert's half-star review held nothing back. "I detest Slaves of New York so much that I distrust my own opinion," he wrote. "The first thing I feel is a genuine dislike for the people in this film, the ambitious climbers on the lower rungs of the ladder in the New York art world. I dislike them because they are stupid and they have occupied my time with boring conversation." Ebert continued with an observation about how artistic ambition had changed. "There was once a time, in decades not too long ago, when life for a young artist consisted of living in a threadbare apartment while trying to create great art, instead of trying to live in a great apartment while creating threadbare art." The film's origin story adds another layer to the disaster. Janowitz originally wrote the screenplay for Andy Warhol, and when Warhol passed in 1987, Merchant Ivory purchased the script. Steve Buscemi and Anthony LaPaglia show up in early appearances, years before they became recognizable names, and the soundtrack featured Nene Cherry's Buffalo Stance, alongside tracks from Public Image Liti and Iggy Pop. Despite the disastrous theatrical run, the film developed an unexpected cult following within LGBTQ communities for its downtown New York aesthetic and drag performance sequences. Today, it plays as a time capsule of 1980s art world pretensions. A promising sequel turned into a career conclusion for one of Hollywood's most versatile talents. Physical Evidence opened on January 27, 1989, through Columbia Pictures with a $17 million budget, bringing back just $3.5 million at the box office for a loss of approximately $13.4 million. Burt Reynolds and Teresa Russell headlined the cast, with Ned Beatty in a supporting role and Michael Crichton directing. That last detail carries real weight because this would mark Crichton's final film as a director. Hollywood would welcome him back as a hugely successful writer, creating Jurassic Park and ER, but he never sat in the director's chair again. The project's troubled history explains much of what went wrong. Physical Evidence started life as a sequel to Jagged Edge, the 1985 thriller, with Glenn Close and Robert Loggia set to reprise their roles. But when David Putnam replaced Guy McElwain as Columbia's head, he killed the sequel outright. Putnam's reasoning came across as straightforward. "I didn't want to make sequels. The script wasn't good and for no other reason. When there's a terrific script for Jagged Edge to Columbia, we'll be anxious to make it." Producer Martin Ransohoff salvaged the project by reworking it as an original story with Burt Reynolds stepping into the lead. The problem was that Reynolds' career had declined precipitously from its late 70s and early 80s peak by 1989. David Kerr of the Chicago Tribune labeled it a feeble thriller, the worst case of filmmaking by numbers, reflecting not an ounce of commitment or conviction. Janet Maslin of the New York Times observed that the film wanders dispiritedly from one suspect to another, never generating much interest in who the real culprit may be. Reynolds tried to put a positive spin on his character, explaining that Joe is a ballsy character, kind of like Dirty Harry gone amok. He's around the edge of having a nervous breakdown, but he has a strange sense of humor about it all. Audiences weren't convinced. Assembling the most incredible cast imaginable still leads to disaster if the script doesn't work. And The January Man proves that star power means nothing without a solid foundation underneath it. January 13th, 1989 brought this film to theaters through MGM, described as lavishly budgeted, though the exact figure never became public. Box office returned just $4.6 million. Rotten Tomatoes assigned it a 28% rating, and Metacritic scored it 33 out of 100. Look at this cast: Kevin Kline, Susan Sarandon, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, Harvey Keitel, Danny Aiello, Rod Steiger, and Alan Rickman. Any single one of those names should have drawn audiences on its own. All of them together should have guaranteed a hit, yet the film flopped anyway. The writer makes this even more baffling. John Patrick Shanley had just collected an Academy Award for writing Moonstruck, making him the hottest screenwriter in Hollywood at that moment. And yet, The January Man, a serial-focused mystery comedy, failed to find any coherent tone whatsoever. Roger Ebert diagnosed the problem with precision. The January Man is worth study as a film that fails to find its tone. It's all over the map. It wants to be zany, but shows disturbing content, satirical, but slapstick, romantic, but cynical. It wants some of its actors to rant and rave like amateur tragedians, and others to reach for subtle nuances. And it wants all of these things to happen at the same time. Ebert added a cutting observation about Shanley. This is the man who wrote Moonstruck. No doubt he had The January Man squirreled away in the back of a drawer and dusted it off when he got his Oscar. It serves as evidence that he didn't write great screenplays to begin with, but worked his way up to them by many stages. Rita Kempley of the Washington Post proved equally brutal. Eliot called April the cruelest month, but then he hadn't seen The January Man. Billed as a mystery with romance and comedy, it's a damp sock of a movie that makes you wish for a leap year. Samuel L. Jackson appears in an uncredited role in the film. Rod Steiger's personal script, bound in red leather with his name embossed in gold, has shown up at rare book auctions over the years. 15 years of waiting went into John Milius's passion project, and the shoot nearly ended him. Farewell to the King arrived on March 3, 1989, through Orion Pictures carrying a $16 million budget, though some sources claim it ran as high as $20 million. Box office returned just $2.4 million, which meant a loss somewhere around $13.6 million. Nick Nolte starred for $3 million, joined by Nigel Havers and James Fox. Milius, who had co-written Apocalypse Now and directed Conan the Barbarian, explained exactly why this story appealed to him. My greatest fantasy is to go off to some foreign land and become a legend of some sort, like The Man Who Would Be King or Heart of Darkness. Leroyd is a character who could have come out of one of those barbershop magazines of the 50s. The production turned into a nightmare almost immediately. Sarawak, Borneo, served as the filming location, where year-round temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit and annual rainfall topped 200 inches. A $200,000 set collapsed completely and had to be rebuilt on concrete foundations, causing a 6-week delay. At one point, a Chinese feng shui master arrived to perform rituals with chickens and pigs meant to exorcise evil spirits from the production. 30 pounds disappeared from Nick Nolte's frame during filming. Nigel Havers called it by far the most difficult film he has ever done, adding, "I dripped all day. This was hot wet." There's something about humidity that can drive a man completely crazy. Orion cut 35 minutes from Milius's original 150-minute cut, and the director complained bitterly, Orion isn't behind it. They don't think it is going to be big at the box office. The producer's attitude is, we paid for the action sequence, let's hear it. Mike Medavoy, Orion's head, later reflected in his memoir. Perhaps audiences weren't ready to see a white soldier become the king of an indigenous tribe in Borneo. It was one of a group of daring Orion movies that didn't make money, but, in retrospect, is a movie we are all very proud to have been a part of. This effectively marked Milius's final theatrical film as director. Terry Jones attempted to recapture Monty Python magic without his fellow Pythons at his side. Erik the Viking opened on September 22, 1989, through Orion Pictures with a budget described as clearly low and a box office return just under $2 million. Rotten Tomatoes assigned it a 47% rating. Tim Robbins took the title role, supported by John Cleese, Mickey Rooney, and Eartha Kitt. Jones adapted the story from his own 1983 children's book. Roger Ebert showed no mercy, awarding 0 stars and writing, "Every once in a while a movie comes along that makes me feel like a human dialysis machine. Erik the Viking is a movie like that. An utterly worthless exercise in waste and wretched excess, uninformed by the slightest spark of humor, wit, or coherence." Chris Willman of the Los Angeles Times described it as a stillborn comedy in which minutes sometimes mysteriously go by between even attempted gags, and in which virtually no comic scene works up to any kind of viable punchline or payoff. The casting carries an interesting backstory. John Cleese replaced Jack Lemmon on short notice as a favor to Jones, and Tom Hulce, who had starred in Amadeus, originally held the Erik role before choosing theater instead. Critics consistently pointed to cheap-looking special effects and very poor matte work as recurring problems throughout the film. Jones himself felt unhappy with the final product and eventually trimmed the film from 107 minutes to 89 minutes for the VHS release. His son Bill re-edited it again in 2006, bringing the runtime down to just 75 minutes in what became known as the director's son's cut. 4 different versions of the film now exist, and none of them seem to have satisfied anyone completely. A skateboarding mystery thriller with a confusing title wasn't exactly what audiences wanted in January of 1989. Gleaming the Cube opened on January 13th through 20th Century Fox with a $10 million budget, returning just $2.7 million at the box office for a loss of approximately $7.2 million. Christian Slater and Stephen Bauer headlined the cast, but the real draw should have been the incredible roster of professional skateboarders involved. Tony Hawk, Tommy Guerrero, Rodney Mullen, and Mike McGill all appeared, bringing authentic skating credibility to the production. The title itself created a problem from the start. Skater Gary Scott Davis posed the cryptic question, "Have you ever gleamed inside a cube?" in a 1983 Thrasher magazine piece, and Slater's character defines it as pushing your limits to the edge, but mainstream audiences had no idea what any of it meant. $500 per day went to Tommy Guerrero to teach Slater skateboarding. Tony Hawk revealed in 2008 that he's continually asked if Slater actually skated in the film. Release timing landed brutally. Dumped in the January dead zone, the film competed against Rain Man's dominance and opened in just 469 theaters. Rotten Tomatoes assigned it a 29% rating. Despite the box office failure, the film enjoyed a surprising cultural afterlife. References popped up in The Simpsons, South Park, Robot Chicken, The Goldbergs, and the Lego Batman movie over the years. Professional skateboarder Stevie Williams credited Slater's character as his first skateboarding influence, and today the film serves as an authentic time capsule of 1980s skate culture. Christian Jacobs, who plays a character named Gremick in the film, later became the lead singer of the Aquabats and created the children's show Yo Gabba Gabba. This neon-colored musical comedy about aliens landing in a manicurist's swimming pool should have been a modest hit, but distribution chaos completely derailed it. Earth Girls Are Easy opened on May 12, 1989, through Vestron Pictures after the budget got cut from $14 million to $10 million. Box office returned just under $4 million. Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum starred as a real-life couple making their third and final film together. But the real historical significance belongs to 2 of the supporting players. Jim Carrey and Damon Wayans, both stand-up comedians at the time, appeared years before their stardom would arrive. Julie Brown's 1984 song provided the origin point for the film. Warner Brothers initially backed the project, but director Julian Temple's previous film, Absolute Beginners, flopped, costing him studio support entirely. Warner approached Madonna and Molly Ringwald to replace Brown in the lead role, and both declined. When Temple insisted on directing, Warner put the film in turnaround. French financing from Crédit Lyonnais came through, with $4 million cut from the original budget, and De Laurentiis Entertainment Group agreed to distribute. And that's when De Laurentiis collapsed in January 1988. The film screened for Carolco, Lorimar, MGM, UA, and Fox before Vestron finally acquired it, with legal entanglements pushing the release from February to May 1989. The future comedy stars already showed their talents on set. Jeff Goldblum, who taught acting classes, would read aloud from books right until action as a focusing technique. Carrey and Wayans made loud noises in character between takes, specifically to distract him, and Julie Brown recalled, "It wasn't easy to work with them, even though they're all really talented." Gina Davis had just collected the Oscar for The Accidental Tourist when this film opened. Within 5 years, Jim Carrey would become one of the biggest stars in the world with Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber. Earth Girls Are Easy now plays as a fascinating glimpse of talent about to explode. Martin Scorsese originally planned to make this Jerry Lee Lewis biopic with Robert De Niro in the lead, and Mickey Rourke with Michael Cimino directing represented another combination under consideration. What audiences got instead was Dennis Quaid in a manic performance that critics found impressive but insufficiently dark. Great Balls of Fire opened on June 30th, 1989, through Orion Pictures with a budget somewhere between $16 and $18 million. Box office returned under $14 million, making this a loss of at least $2 to $4 million. Rotten Tomatoes assigned it a 63% rating, and CinemaScore audiences gave it a B+. Roger Ebert gave 2 stars and explained exactly what went wrong. Great Balls of Fire gives us a Jerry Lee Lewis who has been sanitized, popularized, and lobotomized. An accurate movie could perhaps have been made about the real Jerry Lee Lewis, but it should have been directed by the Martin Scorsese of Raging Bull, and played by Robert De Niro in a foul mood with a bad hangover. The Los Angeles Times called the film colorful, slick, and soulless, claiming it reduced Lewis on screen to Roger Rabbit. Behind the scenes, Jerry Lee Lewis himself re-recorded all his songs for the film. Quaid initially wanted to record his own versions, but when he heard Lewis's new recordings, he insisted that Lewis handle everything. 12 hours of daily piano practice went into learning what Quaid called Lewis-style playing, though the hands visible in close-ups actually belonged to Jason D. Williams, an Arkansas pianist often compared to Lewis. Tragedy marked the film as well. Trey Wilson, who played Sam Phillips, passed from a cerebral hemorrhage in January 1989 at just 40 years old, before the film even opened. This became his final movie. Lewis himself stayed philosophical about the project. It's a movie, and it has to be accepted as a movie. They're doing a movie of my life, and I think it's an honor, and I just hope they pay me. Robert De Niro and Sean Penn approached producer Art Linson wanting to work together. So Linson suggested a story about escaped convicts, hired David Mamet to write the script, and filmed in British Columbia to save 20% on costs. What emerged was We're No Angels, a comedy about criminals pretending to be monks that satisfied neither religious nor secular audiences. December 15th, 1989 brought the film to theaters through Paramount Pictures. $20 million went into the budget, plus an additional $2.5 million Canadian dollars for what became the largest film set ever built in Canada at that time. Box office returned just $10.5 million, making the loss approximately $9.5 million. Roger Ebert actually delivered a positive review, writing that Robert De Niro and Sean Penn have two of the best faces in the movies, screwed up, sideways faces with a lot of mischief in the eyes. We're No Angels is a movie made for those faces. Most critics disagreed, and audiences stayed away regardless. Opening weekend brought in just over $2 million, landing the film in 8th place. Set designer Wolf Kroger created the massive Canadian set over 45 days, constructing 23 buildings, including a monastery with living quarters for 80 monks. The chapel drew its design from a barn. The end credits carry a tribute to Ray McAnally, who played the warden. McAnally passed on June 15, 1989, making this his final feature film. The credits note, in memory of Ray McAnally, 1926 to 1989. Jim Carrey appears in a small role here as well. Combined with Earth Girls Are Easy from the same year, this marked Carrey's second 1989 film to underperform dramatically. Within 5 years, he'd become one of the biggest stars on the planet. Jane Fonda acquired rights to Carlos Fuentes' novel in 1980 before the book even reached publication. Gregory Peck had independently tried to secure those same rights, completely unaware that Fonda already controlled the property. Old Gringo represented a passion project nearly a decade in the making, and it still managed to fall apart. October 6, 1989 brought the film to theaters through Columbia Pictures with an estimated budget around $25 million. Box office results earned the simple description of commercial disaster. Rotten Tomatoes assigned it a 54% rating, and CinemaScore audiences gave it a B. The most dramatic story from production involves Burt Lancaster, who originally won the role of the Old Gringo. Columbia removed him in January 1988 because the studio refused to pay insurance premiums connected to his heart condition, and this happened even after Lancaster passed a medical exam. Lancaster filed a $1.5 million breach of contract lawsuit in response. Jane Fonda offered to use her profit share as an insurance guarantee, just as she had done for her father Henry Fonda on Golden Pond, but this time the studio refused. Gregory Peck stepped in to replace Lancaster just 10 days before shooting began. Roger Ebert observed that, "There is a potentially wonderful story at the heart of Old Gringo, but the movie never finds it, as the screenplay blasts away in every direction except the bullseye. It's heavy on disconnected episodes, light on drama and storytelling." The Chicago Tribune landed even harder, calling it a stillborn epic, a lavish film that means to mix history, politics, and romance, but comes out a coagulated lump. The film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, where Peck received special honors, but the wide release got delayed until October, and whatever festival momentum had been built evaporated completely. Jane Fonda collected a Razzie nomination for Worst Actress, though she lost to Heather Locklear for The Return of Swamp Thing. The most notorious disaster gets saved for last. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen stands as perhaps the most famous box office failure of 1989, a film that earned critical acclaim, 4 Academy Award nominations, and a cinema score of A-, yet somehow became synonymous with catastrophic failure. March 10, 1989 brought the film to theaters through Columbia Pictures. The budget reportedly reached $46.63 million, though the producer later claimed it came in at only $35 million. Domestic box office returned just $8.1 million, making the loss somewhere around $38 million. John Neville, Erik Idle, a young Sarah Polley, Uma Thurman, Oliver Reed, and an uncredited Robin Williams filled out the cast. Terry Gilliam directed, completing what he called his trilogy of imagination after Time Bandits and Brazil. What went wrong comes down to studio politics. David Puttnam greenlit the film while serving as CEO of Columbia, and then Puttnam got replaced by Don Steele during production. The new regime held absolutely no interest in supporting any Puttnam-era projects. Producer Thomas Shuley explained the situation. The problem was that David Puttnam got fired, and all these deals were oral deals. Columbia's new CEO, Don Steele, said, "Whatever David Puttnam has said before doesn't interest me." Terry Gilliam described his futile efforts to save the film. "I was trying very hard to convince Don Steele that this was not a David Puttnam movie. It was a Terry Gilliam movie. I was being pilloried in the press in Hollywood for a guy completely out of control, which was not the case. I had been the guy that humiliated Universal over Brazil, and it was like my comeuppance. The sabotage proved deliberate and thorough. Only 117 prints went to the American market, compared to thousands for typical releases. The film opened in just 46 theaters and expanded to only 92 after 4 weeks, despite strong per-theater averages. Virtually no promotional campaign existed at all." Gilliam offered a bitter observation. "It seemed actually appropriate that Munchausen, the greatest liar in the world, should be a victim of some of the greatest liars in the world." Problems plagued the production itself as well. Film Finances, the completion bond insurer, threatened to sue Gilliam for fraud just 2 days before a deadline. Sean Connery quit the role of the Moon King when production got scaled back. Erik Idle stayed blunt about working with Gilliam. "You don't ever want to be in them. Go and see them by all means, but to be in them, that's madness." Special effects supervisor Richard Conway later broke down in tears when re-watching the film with young star Sarah Polley years later, feeling guilty about endangering her during production. Polley described the ordeal as deeply traumatizing and said she relied on Erik Idle as a surrogate parent on set. The film's implosion, combined with other Columbia disasters like Ishtar and Leonard Part 6, contributed to Columbia merging with TriStar and Coca-Cola, eventually selling the studio to Sony. But here's the thing, the movie itself is actually really good. Rotten Tomatoes assigned it a 90% rating. Criterion Collection released a 4K restoration in January 2023. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen gets remembered today not as a bad film, but as a good film that got deliberately destroyed by its own studio. Looking back at these 15 disasters, several patterns emerge that help explain how Hollywood managed to lose over $100 million in a single year. Star power had become essentially irrelevant for mid-budget films. Gregory Peck, Jane Fonda, Robert De Niro, Sean Penn, Nick Nolte, Kevin Kline, no name could guarantee success anymore. The blockbuster era had arrived, demanding either massive spectacle or modest budgets, and the expensive star vehicle occupying the middle ground was becoming obsolete. Studios actively destroyed their own films that year. Baron Munchausen got sabotaged by Columbia's new regime, Worth Winning and Gleaming the Cube got dumped into dead zone release windows, and Winter People received almost no marketing at all. Studio politics determined fates before audiences ever had a chance to decide for themselves. Development nightmares stripped films of coherence. Millennium spent 10 years bouncing between 4 directors, Farewell to the King lost 35 minutes to studio cuts, and Great Balls of Fire sanitized its subject into irrelevance. And throughout all of this, pre-fame talent was hiding in plain sight. Jim Carrey appeared in 3 different 1989 flops, Tony Hawk skated through Gleaming the Cube, and Steve Buscemi lurked in Slaves of New York. Within a few years, these performers would become major stars, but 1989 wasn't ready for them yet. The summer of 1989 belonged to Batman and Indiana Jones. Everything else fought for scraps and mostly lost. These 15 films represent the price Hollywood paid for that lesson.